My name is Basil Bekdash. I'm a paediatric surgeon, and I also do some clinical safety work, which is how I got to have a say in digital, because no one listens to you unless you have a title of some sort, and that was mine. I'm very grateful to Mark for giving me a soapbox rather than have to carry my own rather disheveled one around. And we're going to talk a little bit about things in a way that hopefully is a bit different. This is not a fireside chat. I'm going to talk as little as possible, and I've assembled a panel of Avengers, experts, who will tell me I'm wrong. I may be crazy, but I don't think I am. I'd say I'm an idealist, and that's why I ask the questions that I ask. I think this meeting, lots of meetings, lots of the conversations I have, lots of things I listen to and we all engage with, still don't convince me that we agree on anything about what we want to achieve with digital and with healthcare in general and in society. And so I think the reason I've asked these people here is they all have something to say about what I'm going to propose as a hypothesis or a challenge to be debunked by you and them. The first of which is really what medical records are, because I don't think we agree. This is just my thoughts on the subject. I'm going to give a couple of little premises for you to think about to provoke questions to the whole panel. That's what I think medical records, medical data fundamentally is. And then I think when you think about the context of how we handle them, we don't agree. We debate authority, control, privacy a lot, and there are polarized opinions, and we don't have a unified consensus to allow us to design, develop, build, deploy, and then benefit from a lot of that. To help with that, I've invited Max. Hello, Max. Who's a sociologist by background and a former medical notes surgeon. Look out, Colonel Pappering. He will hopefully have a lot of insights into what medical records are. That was PhD subject, and please ask questions to him and the rest of the panel on that topic. The second area that I also don't think we agree is what's our priority. We all know that the nature of standards or design data itself is dependent on the output we want to get from it. And we don't agree on what our top priorities are, and we have to have a hierarchy of priorities. I don't think that is clear in strategy nationally or internationally, and I think it's often skewed. So that's what I think is correct. The foundation should be individual care. A clinician, a patient, they interact. The data should be built around that. The other things are built on top of that, and actually research, which is too often the priority and too often dominating the debate around data, is a secondary or tertiary or whatever characteristic. But these are the key priorities. And actually, what we talk about a lot of the time is really operations and operational things, how to do stuff, how to deliver tomorrow, how to fulfill a political policy or a commercial interest, or solve a problem that we face in our work. That, again, should be built on more fundamental basic things. And generally, we spend a lot of time doing that. I think we waste a lot of resource managing the difficulties around data. And to give you another example of things we don't actually do, has anyone considered what we're going to do in 20 years' time when a lawyer and a judge and you might want to defend yourself about what you did in your clinic with a medical record system in the way it looked at the time? I've never seen a software program that can show me, like a wind back the clock on the internet, how it looked 10 days ago, 10 years ago when I was looking at it with the data as it was then. I've not seen a company that's even thinking about designing like that. We copy PDFs and print stuff out and give it to lawyers, and they spend lots of money and time reviewing things. To look at it another way, sorry for the text formatting, we've got priorities of the person or research perhaps at two ends of a spectrum. We often focus on these sorts of biological, physical things. That may be centered around a specialty. I'm a cardiologist, I think about hearts. Yes, there's a person attached, but I'm really heart-based. Or a geneticist that thinks about molecules and genes, and that's important. They all have their value, but should they be the focus of what we're building? In the other direction, we go up sort of the social spectrum through to the whole of humanity. And I think you need to think about, again, where on this spectrum should the core focus of all our efforts be directed? To not miss the other people that may not be in the room anymore, but the biopsychosocial model is pretty well established as a way to look at health and disease. And that is another dimension which I'm not going to try and represent on a 2D slide. But all those things need to be accounted for. And I think the focus of all those three things is an individual. It's grounded in reality, which means our conceptual digital stuff should be grounded on that basis. We also have digital infrastructure. This is XKCD Comet, which people are quite familiar with, about legacy and the problems of legacy and the lack of resource for maintaining important bits of legacy. And when I look at the NHS and healthcare data in general, I kind of get this sort of vision. It's hard to represent the sort of the mind fog or the gut feeling of something isn't quite right. It's hard to take out a bit of this without thinking you're going to break it. It seems complex. It seems to be necessarily complex, but is it too complex? Are we spending too much time creating more and more complexity to manage problems? Geoff is here really to speak to that to some extent. He has experience with the US DoD around the interoperability problem we face in healthcare and how they tried to address it a while ago, looking at fundamentally making things by nature, by design, interoperable, not integratable. So please ask him questions on that if you'd like the detail on that. And in the real world, this is what the NHS tends to do, what government tends to do. You never have time to think about these fundamental things and strategize. Strategy requires time and space where there isn't a priority that's 2 days away. Clinical safety officers, please sign this off, we're deploying next week. Oh, thank you, we procured it 6 years ago, we didn't tell you about it. That kind of doesn't work. That's the reality you face if you're doing active deployments and active development of anything, whether you're commercial or not. And if I was going to get an AI to redo this, I'd have him rebuilding the train at the same time as laying the new tracks. So I think we need parallel planning for those sorts of long-term things, which we don't have. There's a 10-year plan, but the 10-year plan is about delivery. It's not about strategy. And you may want to ask Charlie about that. His work around standards does look at perhaps setting strategy, and he's been involved in the real world of doing stuff with what we already have off the shelf, which is generally what people default to, but isn't going to deliver the ideals that I fantasize about. So welcome, Charlie, and thank you for stepping in at rather short notice to fill in. And finally, all equally important, but one of the reasons I think we don't agree is that this is a human and a social problem, but ultimately it's not a technical problem. There are many technical ways to address the things I've mentioned that we haven't developed or done. The social problem is we don't agree, and we don't have the politics to support that. I personally come from a paediatric background. I think we can leverage the human life cycle. We can leverage the universal nature of childhood. It's the only human universal concept. There was one person in the audience that I can look after clinically, and he's gone. But we've all been through that, and sadly, some of us don't get to be adults. Most of healthcare, most social issues are relevant in the child sphere, and we can design and develop in that model. And I think that's the practical way that if we wanted to collectively do something about the larger strategy around this, to evaluate the things we have and the things we haven't imagined, it is a potential place to do that. Abby's here because she does done a lot of work about the citizen and society, both about children and young people, but more broadly in a lot of areas. And I'm hoping she'll be able to incite insights around whether that is a way to get out of our own way and out of our own individual special interests, commercial, political, specialty, whatever, to face a challenge that is not going away, because in over 50 years of digital health and healthcare development, we've made progress, but have we really gone in the right direction consistently? I'm not sure. And that's with great respect to all the past work and the much cleverer people that have worked on this, that forerun what we are doing now. So the question should be, why haven't we got further than we have, even though we have made progress? And on that note, I think I can stop talking. And do we need a blank slate, even if it's just a way to trick ourselves into doing what needs to be done? Thank you. So I will open to the floor, because I want you and the panel to interact and to discuss some of the things I think are right, but I want to be told I'm wrong about, so I can stop wasting my time.
Okay, good. Can we even have a blank slate? Technically, like physically, like given the legacy that we have in healthcare and the importance of having access to, you know, somebody at that end of the spectrum in their journey, how if we can, how would you go about introducing a blank slate without wiping out, you know, most of somebody's health record?
Well, I mean, data and digital technology used in health and care is used to support health and care. Health and care is continuing to happen. There's no possibility, there's no sense in talking about a blank slate in that case. So we are where we are. We are going to continue using data as part of the process of delivering care. So I don't think, I think you're right, it's not possible. And it doesn't really make sense. It does make sense to think, can we transition to something new? So I've worked on a maternity system. We promised that we'd do a data migration of all the data from the old system into the new one. We pretty quickly decided that was a bad idea, and they parallel ran for 6 months, and every new pregnancy went on the new system, and that was a far more sensible way of working. So I think there is those sorts of opportunities. I think we a lot of health data becomes less relevant 6 months, 12 months later. So I think we have got opportunities for change in data that we don't necessarily embrace all the time. So that
The keynote yesterday kicked off by describing the NHS facing an existential existence crisis. We've heard that before, 10 years ago and 10 years before that. The difference is that I've now spoken to people in this room who actually feel it's more real now than it's ever been. And clearly what we're doing isn't working. So if we don't have a blank slate mentality and rethink fundamentally what we're doing, then we cannot possibly address the existential problem. We have to leapfrog from where we are to a better way of doing that meets the requirements of the NHS in 10 years' time. And you can't do that by iterating what doesn't work today, because you're just going to make it worse tomorrow. In fact, that's exactly what I hear time and time again in every discussion here is, yeah, you know, great idea, try to do this, hit this wall, hit that wall, bounced off this, bounced off that. So we need to blank slate to rethink the value proposition of the values that we need to build into a digital architecture that enables the people in this room to do what they want to do so they can achieve for the patient what the patient needs done for them. And we don't have a digital architecture today that does that. So I don't think there's a choice. Now, the way to achieve that, and the way where you've done it in other sectors, is you find your skunk works. But they have to be big skunk works. They have to be places where you can fundamentally say, what we're doing today we know doesn't work. And paediatrics is a very interesting one. It's not a well-served sector within the NHS for digital infrastructural support. So and it's a great one, as Basil has highlighted, where we could say, well, whatever we build there has to grow with the child into adulthood and into old age. So surely that's a good place to think about a skunk works. And when I say skunk works, I don't mean some tiddlywink project. I mean, you know, the kinds of projects we did in the DoD to prove it. We put 20 million here, 20 million there, 30 million there, and we ran 3 different projects. And we proved the technology, we changed the supply chain, and we fundamentally adopted new ways of working that did meet the requirements of the Department of Defense 10 years' time. And people in this room might say, well, what's that got to do with the NHS? Pretty simple. If our digital systems don't come together in real time to meet the real-time requirements of frontline clinicians, there's a risk somebody will die. And it's exactly the same in a combat environment as it is in the A&E department or in a GP surgery. We have that same problem set, and we can adopt technological approaches that have been tested, developed, and proven in other sectors. There's a lot of technology out there, but we need to define a value system that allows us to say which bits are the bits we want, and if we bring those together, can we redefine the slate and redefine the way in which the NHS operates? And by the way, I would say you start with procurement, because ultimately it's about money. And if procurement doesn't understand the technological opportunity, you'll never get what you want.
I have something to say, but I'm happy to take another question if you would prefer to.
Hi, Sorry, that's working right. Okay, I'm a patient representative, sticking my head into this conference with some trepidation, but I'm the chair of the patient group for the local GP in Painswick. What I'm appalled by in that last little speech was that everything started and revolved around the clinicians. I think it should be the patient. Now, the recent experience of patients is that through the NHS app, we've got access to our patient record. And we've been doing a lot as a patient group to help our patients with a ageing demographic to access digital things. Firstly, the triage system that our surgery is running now successfully, and most recently the NHS app. When we take them into their patient record, which sounds such a good idea that you can look back at what's happened to you, it's gobbledygook, absolute gobbledygook. It's got tons of simple things like you had a vaccination, COVID vaccination last October or something, which are quite useful because they're meaningful activities. Lots of them are that you've received messages. You've had a text, you've had a text, you've had a text, you've had a text over and over again, and you have to plough your way back to find anything that's of any real use. And you can't really do that going back very far. So someone with a longer term condition might want to know how were they 5 years ago, and that's really hard to find. So the gist of what I'm saying is that from the patient perspective, we need something quite different than the clinician's perspective. I would have thought, with my limited experience and understanding of IT, that the same basic core information that is held already in that record could be treated, but could be coded with the different inputs, such that a shortened summary came to the patient that was meaningful and useful to them, that a similar sort of thing could go to the clinician that was useful to them. And then the third layer, I guess, is covering your back. There's a litigation potential there, I guess. I notice that doctors are rather conscious of litigation, that might need to just track, quite what happened to this patient over time. But to separate those out, it seems to me, is absolutely essential. And I really look forward to the day when a patient can look at their record in a way that was accessible, meaningful, and useful.
Yeah, I have a lot to say, I guess. So I'll give a very quick background. So I'm a sociologist by kind of training, but I spent 10 years working in the NHS. I started as a medical records note runner. So I pulled notes from medical records libraries and ran them to the ward, and then ended as a kind of product owner of an EDM system, which is electronic document management, right? So it was about scanning patient records in. And then I wrote my PhD on the medical record, and I think so. I'll come back to the blank slate stuff first, and then I'll come to patients. So I mean, I think it's worth remembering, right? In theory, right, we kind of did have a blank slate 20 years ago. So Tony Blair in the early 2000s, MP Fit, idea was, hey, we have this paper medical record, and it's limited in all of these ways, right? Because of its paperness, right? So the big kind of line was, if you're a doctor in Birmingham and you're seeing a patient who's from Bradford, you can't see their notes, right? And that's crazy. And we're 20 years later, if you go to Birmingham, you still can't see the notes from Bradford. And why is that? Well, the interesting reason is it's not a technical reason. There's no technical reason why we can't make PDFs available from Bradford to a computer terminal in Birmingham. So what has the past 20 years been about? Well, it's been about a blank slate, right? We had a medical record for about 100 years that was broadly agreed that we would have a folder with a patient's name on the front, and in it we would keep clinical information that was relevant to that patient. And the doctors really had the kind of biggest say over what constituted important information regarding that patient. Over the last 20 years, the attempt has been made to restrict the doctor's ability to say what is important about the patient and move it somewhere else. So if we think about this in a kind of concrete example of SNOMED, SNOMED is a structured language that pre-exists the doctor, right? The doctor can no longer come along and say, this patient, Mr. Smith, has got kind of suspected rheumatoid arthritis, but it's really localized in their third knuckle on their left hand. And so I'm just going to kind of write that in a woolly way. I have to give a very specific diagnosis. Now, this is obviously hugely beneficial to researchers, so open safely, for example, but secure data environments, Tony Blair's current, Tony Blair Institute, the idea of building large population data sets. This is kind of hugely valuable from a kind of non-patient perspective. Or from a research perspective, I suppose. It's also incredibly useful to be able to control your doctors, right? You know, decision support technologies, automation. You know, yesterday the opening gambit was basically we've got workforce crisis in the NHS. These doctors are incredibly expensive to handle. They're fewer and fewer, and we don't want to train anymore, right? Okay, so this kind of 20 years has been a blank slate, right? This process of digitization is often kind of, you know, imagined to be a kind of just a kind of natural process of, you know, things just turning into bits. It's not, right? There are kind of very specific kind of political and human decisions about what kind of digital record we want. And so that then comes to this kind of idea of the patient. Now, I think my kind of controversial line, and I think that's kind of what Basil is interested in bringing me along for, is I am a sort of doctor apologist in many ways. Like, I actually think it's really important that the clinician has a record, right? And I think this because the doctor trying to understand what happens to a patient and try and guide a patient through a pathway is quite a kind of unique aspect of society. We don't have it in many other places. A patient can pitch up and say, I need help, and the doctor is obliged to provide them with help. Now, I think that's a kind of really unique relationship, and the medical record is a tool to allow that to happen, right? And so in Basil's example, if he says he just cares about hearts, well, how is it that he's able to talk more holistically about a patient? Well, actually, it turns out the medical record has a kind of really key role in this. You know, if a GP refers a patient to a specialist pediatrician, they'll write a letter and they'll say, I'm sending you Mr. Perry along to your cardiac clinic. They've got shortness of breath, they've got palpitations. I'm not overly concerned about this, but I would really appreciate the opinion of a specialist. And then if Basil is seeing the patient as they kind of walk in, they can then have a kind of conversation with this patient about that based on this kind of letter that has all of this woolly, subjective stuff kind of tied in the middle of it. Now, the problem if we kind of consider the medical record as just a series of facts that can then be summarized with code or something else, you require somebody to do that kind of curation work. Now, previously that was doctors doing that, talking to each other through letters normally, referral letters, clinic letters, discharge summaries were the kind of primary units of the medical record. And all of those were ideally gauged towards clinicians. Now, making them available to patients did a kind of actually a hugely useful thing as well. But I think thinking about kind of who the audience is for the medical record kind of at large is a really interesting thing to do. But I really don't think it's useful to kind of say that clinicians have a kind of unhealthy power over the medical record, because actually they have an unhealthy power over you, and it's quite useful for them to have a kind of big say in the kind of epistemic processes that are involved.
Oh, I think I very much agree with. I find your work on, you know, what is the medical record and taking a historical perspective to that is just so helpful, kind of from a design perspective, because I'm a designer. Actually, I wondered if I could kind of speak to both questions briefly. I don't think we can start with a blank slate, first of all, even though I know it could be incredibly useful to be able to design something that's actually going to function well for everyone. But what I do think is that it's so critically important to make sure that the tools, the services, and those kind of touch points to them through interfaces are actually usable and useful does require time. So one of the most frustrating things is seeing how these programs of kind of digital transformation are just so directed by, you know, politics and government, and unfortunately aren't long term enough. So my kind of coming back to Basil's point, and also David, your point about what it means for a patient to use the NHS app. Actually, the international standard for design, the kind of ISO, is human-centered design. That's still the international standard. However, lots of people are exploring what would advance that, with the latest AI and data infused technologies that are coming out. And actually, I find the concept of community-centered design really useful and interesting for trying to kind of really push where some of the biggest challenges might be for how AI and data can be used to drive service and system design. So I just wanted to kind of just put a couple of provocations out that builds on what Max was saying, and also others. So actually, I have been part of a kind of programmatic piece of work over a decade, really, that's sort of consulted really diverse stakeholders about how they might feel about capturing their own data and sharing it, patient-generated data, for the purposes of research and non-research. The idea of your data being captured in a secure data environment, etc. And we also, as part of that, work with voluntary sector organisations, that hold really vital NHS contracts. And actually, the places that people can come to meet with others to actually manage their health and well-being longer term, whether that's managing multiple long-term conditions or whatever it might be. Something that I think is really underserved and underrepresented at the moment in the conversations about health tech innovation are thinking about the data practices and the work, the vital work in these kinds of community-based organizations, but also, it's where, if it's patient groups or if it's just people living, in their communities, how they can support each other to, look together at a section on the NHS app and try and interpret what does this mean. And if I take the case of mental health and a recovery college that definitely isn't well enough resourced, and this is in Newcastle where I live, there are people working there and lots of different organizations that have to kind of try and keep up all the time with their organizational practices and how they're working with data, for example, to contribute to the national mental health data set. And that poses problems of consent, having to revise consent processes, having to think about how people can become re-identified if they've shared more qualitative data, thinking about how people may, when they need help the most, they might not want anything to be on a record, that sometimes the most important kind of face-to-face interactions around managing health and care. And with this, I'm bringing forward the discussion at the last session as well, because I think it's actually about people working together to problem solve, to find workarounds, to learn, to upskill, and all of this. So you could talk about this in a within the NHS workforce. You could talk about this in a community organisation. You could talk about this in a community where peer support and patient support is sought. But these kinds of communications may not be intelligible at all to AI. And I think there's an invisibility to it. And so coming back to Basil's point, I really feel that actually we almost need to, if we turn it on its head and we just think much more long term around how we can systematically address this challenge, that actually it needs to be community infused design, so that actual people supporting each other is really not lost, and that the AI learns what that means.
Thank you, Abby. Does anyone ask a question responding to that? Something's different? Back to the audience.
I can sort of follow on from that. I'm a GP and I've been in digital shared care records for quite a long time, trying to figure out what's going on, basically, all these different sort of versions of things. And it's come to me, my thought of what is the real truth when the patient, when you're describing, looking through a patient record and it's full of all this other bits and pieces in there, you get lost of what's happening around a patient. It's because, when you're talking to a patient, when you look at your patient record, you can see it's loads and loads of bits, all from time, from lots of different organisations coming together, so you can't see anything. The problem is, previously those notes were written for doctor-to-doctor conversations, but now you're writing them for the doctor-to-patient, and then you're writing letters that go to the patient, but you're actually trying to talk to another doctor, so you're kind of having hidden meanings in there, because you're kind of like, I want you to be a little bit more careful with this person. They've got some other issues going on here, which I can't tell you in this letter. There's so many other narratives going on. So my worry is that where is the truth in it? We need to make EPR systems that can summarize a patient record. We can't expect someone to look at a record and know everything that's in there. So we have to create a summary of it. How do you take out that bias? How do you give the patient the narrative to put in there, but still not lose the other clinical problems which are going on? And when when you take a patient into the hospital, they can tell their story at the door. Then, half an hour later, someone else goes up and they ask the same story, and it's changed already. So, how can a clinical system keep up with so much flex?
So to take some of those themes, I'm going to ask Charlie a question, which I think Geoff might then respond to. So we were talking a little bit earlier about standards are important for some of that. What they should be, what is important for that. Charlie, you said about following the money, which will mean different things to different people. So I'm going to let you explain what you mean by that. And then Geoff might want to talk about sort of the implications of that, particularly with his comments referring to procurement, whether the two agree or disagree on how you address that particular aspect of the problem, because it does skew things either positively in, I think, your mind or negatively in the minds of some.
So, yeah, and I think to quickly respond on how we're using data, the way we've delivered healthcare has changed a lot over the last 40 years. You don't have a one-to-one relationship with a GP anymore. So what we're trying to do in the way we kind of receive care and experience care in the NHS is changing. And maybe we're not acknowledging that all the time. The other thing is that what we're using computers and digital communication for is lots of different things. Some of it is collecting coded data that wants to be analyzable. Some of it is we're using telephones and text as a way to do ephemeral chat that is intended to be lost, that we wouldn't want other people to be seeing. And if we turn that into stuff that is then published and public, those private conversations between the clinician and the patient get lost. And I think that's a worry. So I think we need to think about what it is that we need to define. And that's then where I think standards do come in. So there are things that it's worth standardizing. If we look at what happened with containerization of ships, that cut the price of shifting goods around by 95%. And it made all sorts of things possible by identifying a really simple, small piece of standardization, standardizing the size of the box that you put on and off ships and trains. And I think we need to do the same with data. We need to identify where's it useful to standardize things. We hear the policy statements, and no one says it's a bad idea to have standards. Everyone lists standards as one of the things that they need in digital transformation or any other transformation. Work out the things that you can do repeatedly and repeat them. That's the best way to deliver things at scale. But if we look at where the money's being spent, we're not seeing investment in standards. We're not seeing investment in the communities and the governance structures that allow for open standards to be developed and maintained. We're seeing the funding for the PRSB being cut by NHS England. We're seeing other organisations being cut and underfunded, and people not having reserved time to give to that standards work and to that community and consensus building work. And the other thing I'd like to do is sort of identify, I'd like us to start thinking about data as a medical device. And if we did that, what would that mean? If you think of data as a medical device, you'd say, what's its intended use? You'd articulate that intended use really clearly. And you'd also say, what's its context of use? And you define what are the activities, the decisions, the processes that it's intended to be used to support. And that's something that I think the standards bodies, again, can and should be doing, so that we can have agreement as to what that context of use is for our medical services, products, and data, the data that we want to standardize. And then I think we'll be in a position to move forward.
Thanks, Charlie. Geoff,
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. Data as a medical device. Completely agree with that. Within the DoD, one of the things, of the many things we understood we had to do in order to make a very, very large scale, super scale system of systems work, was to remove the problem of the interpretation of the data from the programmer and into the data model. And they also built, as one of the Skunkworks project, a safety critical flight control system based around a data model that was safety critical. And that was because there was sufficient semantic knowledge around the data that they could confidently use it and test it and validate it to safety critical standards. This is a major proof point. The thing is, that technology exists. That approach would be different. The type of semantic data we would choose to integrate would be different. How we would do it would be different. But essentially, it's the same technological approach. The other part of your question was something around the accessibility or movement of that data, right? Who's it for? And how do I communicate it? Because that changes the nature of what you communicate. If it's to a patient, I present it very differently to another doctor. And yet our systems aren't really thinking like that at all. I run a health tech startup. We won an innovation award to build a patient-centered, confidential by design, managed self-care platform for mental health. That's what we designed. The first thing I did was remove any clinicians from the thought process of what that was going to be. Because no matter what you do, when you talk about bias in data, you get bias in outcomes when a clinician's there, because they can't help but realize that if this system helps me, I'm going to help the patient. So that's the first thing. No. First thing is the patient. I can then package the solution for the clinician so that it serves them too. So if you do patient-centered, you don't want the clinician in the process, right? And that's, I'm saying that deliberately to be contentious, right? Yeah. Now, the thing that we discovered in that process was around the data was that we wanted to be able to create channels of communication for the same data set that sometimes went to a doctor, another doctor in a follow-on process, and sometimes went to the patient. And what we found was there was nothing in the data models that helped us define how we would manage that. Because there's no standard for that within the NHS at all. Because the NHS doesn't have a clear understanding of who should have access to what and for what purpose. And that should be part of the data model.
So we have, excuse me, we have a question from Karen online, and then a follow-up question very similar to it from Joe McDonald, who's listening to us in spirit from somewhere else in the ether. Karen says, should we change our language and rename the medical record to the health record, as this is now so much more than a medical record? And then Joe McDonald says, or care record.
Yeah, that is a good question. So I guess I will circle around to what the medical record is. I guess this kind of patient record, citizen record. You know, this gets talked about a lot now. The single patient record is in many ways that, right? You know, that's kind of the idea. But I'd like to just very quickly kind of circle back around to this idea of truth, which came from the audience. So, I'm a social scientist. I often consider myself a little bit of a philosopher as well, right? So the idea of truth is a kind of really interesting question to me. And standards, what are standards doing, right, in the medical record? Well, they're in some ways predefining what can be considered truthful or untruthful. So this is a little bit kind of techie, but for those of you kind of interested, so SNOMED calls itself a database ontology. Ontology is a word borrowed from philosophy, borrowed by a guy called Thomas Gruber in the 1990s. He was a computer scientist, one of the developers of Siri. And he said, if we have all of these databases, what we need is ontologies, right? And I've borrowed this from philosophy. Don't really worry about its kind of philosophical baggage, but that's what we need. And what that means is we need to agree upon certain things. So his example might be, yellow. We need to all agree what yellow is. So if you enter yellow into your system somewhere, and somebody else enters yellow into another system somewhere else, when it lives in the database, it needs the same hex code, right? We need to all agree upon what yellow is. So these kind of database engineers, so there is a job now, which I find very exciting, called ontology engineer, right? Which is, that, like, in a kind of old school way, this is reality engineer. That's kind of what that means, right? Ontology is the understanding of reality at large. And so this kind of question of truth is actually a profoundly important one when we're thinking about medical records. Standards are ways of regimenting truthful discourse, truthful talk, what can constitute truthful and what can constitute untruthful. And so when we think about these kind of ideas of standards, we're really thinking about who gets to say what constitutes true and untrue. And again, for a long time, and I don't want to overly defend doctors, right? Because doctors have all of these problems of paternalism and error and all of this kind of stuff. But for the longest time, doctors held the most amount of power to say truthfully what was wrong with their patients. Now, over the past 20 years, digitization has attempted to wrest that control from doctors and distribute it more broadly across the NHS at large. So that's kind of my perspective of what's been happening, I suppose. Now, to just come back around to this idea of what we should call the medical record, again, my PhD, I would encourage you all to go and read it. It's called Sociology of the Medical Record. I draw a history of the medical record which goes back about 100 years. Now, there was a lady in New York called Dorothy Kurtz who invented the medical record. She called it the unique medical record. She wrote a book about it. It was reviewed in the UK. She came and spoke at UK conferences. And in that book, she said, we should have medical records that are centered around the central unit of the patient. Before that, medical record didn't exist. It was different things, right? It's something fundamentally different. We are currently at a point, the single patient record, where it is being redesigned. It is a new kind of machine. This kind of idea of a citizen record, a person record, this kind of stuff is about kind of saying, yeah, that unit medical record had its day, it's finished. We need something new. And that central unit is no longer the patient, somebody who comes to a health service who requires health or requires healing, but this is about the kind of proactive, preventative approaches that are attached to the 10-year plan, kind of as it exists. And so I think, you can have an opinion about whether that's good or bad, but one of the things that I think we all need to become clear on, I feel very passionately about this, is that is a very significant change in the way that we do the kind of bureaucratic work of medicine. And that we need to kind of have a think kind of reasonably between us all about whether we want to make that change or not.
As a very quick question, do you think it matters if the name is changed? Or is it semantic? Okay. Can I see if there's probably time for one more broad theme to come from the audience? So, Tim?
Just one question. In the last 40 years, the part of computers has increased by about 20,000-fold. Since, however, GP computing is still much the same as it ever was 40 years ago, and it's still quite good. Hospital computing remains variable, let's put it this way. Why?
Okay. So how can I frame this then? So the problem is unchanged, the technology is better, but we've moved no further.
Yeah, I guess reacting to that, but also to the suggestion that standards are about defining truth. I'm not being a little bit philosophical as well, would say that standards are around regulating the language game. And what we're doing with language and with data is we're communicating communities. We're people who are trying to rub along and do stuff together. And we use language as a way of doing that. And one of the things that, sometimes we use natural language and we kind of negotiate what that means and we kind of understand it and learn it. And we have standardized language, and that's what we do in the PRSB for some things where we want to give very specific definitions and intended use for data items. And that's where we're standardizing. So it's regulating that language game, I'd say, is what we're doing. And I think if we look at the difference between GP and community and hospital systems, I think part of that is those communicating communities need to step up and play the game. And playing the game means deciding what you're going to talk about and deciding what of it you need to standardize, what of it you need to do in a more graceful, dance-like way. And so I think it's all of us have to step up and play the game better.
If you're saying we haven't done it, I'll let Abby give her thoughts on your question, which is
Do you know what? Because then I'll pass to Geoff. I'm so conscious of time. I actually really agree with you, Charles, and I just think we need to use that to guide good design, because I know I made that point about how AI and large language models need to learn. We need to feed them with this understanding of what that means, what you said, what that means in reality, that best practice, that shared understanding and consensus, that needs to be fed in to the systems that are gonna, do their work with or without a human in the loop. And I think that's where I am concerned about the future. So I don't think it is possible to have a blank slate, because from my experience, the best design has been achieved through iteration and ultimately cycles of learning, and failure, and then learning together. So yeah.
thank you, Geoff.
I want to go more directly to your question. So again, within the DoD example, we took an existing use case where a certain application built by, I'm going to name them, IBM, had 20 plus computers involved in resolving and supporting a appropriately responsive system to some application need. Right? Once you restructured and rethought about the nature of the software architecture and the fundamental values and needs that it needed to have in order to support the wider defense sector in this case, that was rewritten in 3 months and ran on a single computer of the same power as one of the 20. So to answer your question, the reason that I suspect a large part of the NHS fails to advance its utilization of compute capacity is because it's still using software technologies that consume too much information, share inappropriately across networks that can't manage it, in order to do something that could be done a lot better in a different way, because there are better and understood techniques for doing it, which is why we need a white slate to rebuild that architectural model so that we can take existing hardware infrastructure and actually be responsive and utilize it more effectively.
I think we're close to time, so I guess I'll be told to stop soon. Are there any very pressing thoughts or questions that must be brief before I just give my final thoughts on what is very much scratching the surface of what I think is a very important problem that we should address? If not, in that case, as you can see, I don't think we still agree on the things I brought to you today, but I hope it's opened the door to discussing them. DHN's got these lunchtime sessions on Friday. Actually, I'm going to speak on one with Ming Tang and Lee Rickles in a couple of weeks, first week in November, which is around the single patient record, where I will bring the similar sort of thoughts on these themes there if anyone's interested. Please contact any of the panel on the bits you feel most relevant to them if you're interested, because I'm sure they'll be very keen to take the conversation further. Likewise, I had lots of thoughts how to bite my tongue about this, but that wasn't the point of today. I live in hope that one day I'll be told I'm right or wrong, or that we can do something about it. Abby, you've seen what?
I actually, because I know we've had lots of interesting conversations about this, I think that would be a fantasy situation to have a blank slate. I just think if we did that, we would just need time. It would take time to make sure that everybody is involved in it. That's the thing.
And I guess that's my thing about doing things in parallel. But on that point, I'll leave you to think about it and enjoy your lunch. Thank you all for listening. I hope it was interesting.